Hello, my name is Jon Pulseston from GMI Interactive, and I've been asked today to give a sort of summary, perhaps, of my views on how to design investor surveys. It's obviously quite an enormous topic, and I've got 20 minutes, so this is very much a top-line view and a condensation of maybe sort of my, all the work and research I've done in this whole area over the last few years. And some of you may well have seen some of my earlier presentations on this topic, so I hope I'm not going to be repeating myself too much. And this is, in a sense, a sort of a retrospective look at some of the research that I've done and what I've learned along the way. The first thought I want to embed in your mind is thinking about a survey as a piece of entertainment, and the relationship between how much people are enjoying themselves and how much they then concentrate on the answers they give in their survey. I'll show you a piece of research we did about a year or so ago with Bernie Malinoff, where we looked directly at how much people enjoyed answering particular questions, how much fun they were, and looked at how much time they spent answering questions, and looked at the quality of the feedback we got back. And there's almost a linear relationship you can see here between the average level of fun, how much effort they put into answering the questions, and the level of straight lining, and reduction in the level of straight lining. And I think that's a common theme that we see in all our research, in that if respondents are engaged and it's entertaining, they'll concentrate more and you get better data, and that's a real critical issue in online research. Now, these techniques, is it technically gamification I'm talking about here? Now, this is one of the sort of buzzwords and things I've been talking about for the last year or two. The word gamification has now become a bit of a metaphor for taking a more creative approach to survey design, but it's been a bit of a rolling snowball of a term. I'm billed as talking about gamification in this presentation. I actually feel a bit more comfortable thinking about copywriting and art directing rather than gamification. All these techniques are really about thinking about treating a survey as a piece of creative communication, a bit like an advertising agency would treat an advert. And the challenge, specific creative challenge we face in online research is how to work out how to motivate people to think, and think in the right sorts of ways. And so the first question I think you should be asking yourself whenever you're thinking about designing a piece of research is, why would anyone want to do my survey? And that thought should sit on your shoulder, not just at a survey level, but on every single question you write. And you have to be constantly challenging yourself about, why would anybody want to answer this question? And what we've discovered is that if you can think of a really good hook that motivates people to do a survey or answer a particular question, you can get a lot better feedback from respondents. And here are some examples of what I'm talking about. Say, for example, you're doing a retail segmentation survey. We did this for a client earlier on in the year. What we did is we asked people to imagine that they were designing their perfect supermarket, and what would it be like? And within that framework, we found that we were able to significantly improve the completion rate of the survey and then the overall quality of the data. The next example here is asking people to evaluate a product, which is a very common thing that people were asked to do. And we've developed a mechanic where we ask people to imagine that they're the judge of a product and the product's on trial. And we find that in that framework, people really do enjoy doing the process a bit more, and we can push up enjoyment, and with that we can push up the quality of feedback we're getting. The third example was taken from the papers we did a few years back, where we were looking at how to get people to talk about their feelings and attitudes towards using baby wipes. And we introduced the survey with an idea that they were the experts on this topic, and we wanted to mine their expert opinions about this thing, because they, as parents, they've used a lot of them potentially. And we found that basic mechanic, along with some sort of visual stimulus of babies and so on, really dramatically improved the volume of word count that we were getting back from respondents. The last example I want to show you is one of the experiments we covered in our game experiments paper published in the SMR Congress last year, where we took a media touchpoint study and we asked people to imagine that they were had £1 million to spend on buying an advertising campaign, and they had to evaluate media in that context. And we discovered that it encouraged people to put a lot more thought into their answers. Generally speaking, we find that a hook to doing a survey can deliver potentially 20% plus improvements in feedback. If you can think of an all-round concept, it's not often easy to do, but if you can think of an idea that encourages people to want to do your whole survey collectively, it's a very powerful weapon to get people to be engaged and give you more feedback. The next thought is really how you kick off surveys. I mean, I see so many surveys that just jump straight into the nitty-gritty of the question you want to know, not really realizing that when you start a survey, it's important to get people in the right frame of mind to want to answer questions and get thinking about a topic. I think the very first question in the survey is a very powerful weapon to frame people's viewpoints, get them stimulated to want to think about the topic under consideration. So, say for example, you were doing a survey about confectionery or chocolate or something. You know, a typical survey might say which of these confectionery brands you were of. Well, how about starting up with how would you feel if the government banned chocolate, to solicit a sort of emotional reaction to people who examine their emotional feelings about that topic. And you can do this in more or less fun ways. It's not necessarily all about fun. It's about employing a key question that's on people's minds about a topic, and an area that will stimulate their interest, and press a button in a sense inside them. So say we were doing a survey about inkjet cartridges, maybe a fairly dull topic. Well, what's the one thing that bothers people about inkjet cartridge? Is whether they cost, perhaps, and so you might have an opening question that minds their feelings towards that gets them then more roundedly interested in talking about that, their experiences of using that product. Or say a survey about investments, you might want to think about whether they feel their investments is well looked after. I.e., you're trying to sort of like look at the topic from the perspective of the respondent and saying what is the key thing that they want to give feedback on, and that would draw them in to discuss about this topic. The next thought is realizing the power of wordplay. The way that you word questions it can be incredibly impactful on the quality of feedback you get back. And I've done a lot of work from this, and a lot of my papers explore this whole topic. And it's about getting an understanding of what triggers an interest in the question. And here are some examples. I could ask you how much you would disagree or agree with a topic, which is a very common thing to do. Or you could ask someone how much like these people are you, which is about them and it's a more personal, contextualized version of the question. I could ask you which brands would you consider using, or I can imagine asking people in their perfect supermarket what brands would you think that we should stock. Little tricks that basically make the tricks of wordplay that make the question relevant to them and make it interesting for them to answer. We find that these sorts of things can trigger more feedback, often quite significant improvements in feedback. And it's a whole topic in itself, and a whole presentation in itself, and I've written about it in my papers that are well worth reading through, but it's about making things more human, introducing a sense of playfulness, invoking conjecture, using rules and conditions, setting questions up as challenges, adopting the techniques of neuro-linguistic programming to do things like embedding commands, and applying basic social psychology techniques. All those sorts of things can be used and applied to make questions more interesting to answer. I think one word I'd encourage you to use more in surveys is the word imagine. Imagine is an incredibly powerful, stimulating word for people to get them thinking about a topic. So here's an example. I asked people to make a list of their favourite shops, or asked people to imagine they could set up their own perfect shopping centre with just the shops they wanted to have in their shopping centre. What shops would they have in their shopping centre? And you move from people giving on average 4 or 5 shops to giving 15, 20, and I mean, this is raw data. You get about 4 times as much information by rewording the question like that. My next thought is, questions are really good opportunities to unlock thinking process, and I want to think about using questions to unlock thinking processes. Many questions we ask in surveys actually are really quite complex pieces that demand quite complex pieces of thinking. Just think of a simple question like, can you rate your bank? and all the factors involved in that process. You know, it could be anything from the experience of last time they went to the bank and they had to queue up, or you know, the value for money they offer, to the sort of the quality of the emails they send through, or how easy it is to use their website. And in that one question, you're trying to ask people to do all sorts of things, and it becomes a very difficult thing for people to really get their head around an answer. And as a result of that, they almost give up and they just give a sort of raw response. You know, they might say 7 or something. And what does that mean? And now, I think that if more carefully choosing that question and navigating through that thinking process can unlock, you know, some rational understanding of what they're asking them to do. So, for example, I could ask you, actually, is your bank perfect? And that's a lot easier for respondents to get their head around and say yes or no to. And then you might follow that with the question, well, how perfect is it? Or how close to perfect is it? And then you can farm their thoughts about why it's not perfect. And so the question is leading them through a mental process that then you can then encourage them to then think about the answers themselves. I'd like to encourage people to do more, ask questions that encourage more thinking in surveys generally. And so many of the surveys I see are littered with very closed, low processing thinking tasks, like what is your favourite colour equivalent, or do you agree or disagree with this? And all the research I've done shows that respondents really like thinking, and the most successful surveys are often the ones that encourage people to do the most thinking. And that can be applied holistically, but even just down to the simplicity of how you ask a question. And I would like you to think about respondents as consultants rather than respondents, and try and think about pitching them the problem, not your interpretation of the problem, which might be, for example, if you're assessing the value of one product versus another, you might ask, do you like this product? But you might actually ask them, would you invest in this product? If it was your product, how which would you choose? And bring them into the problem and challenge them to do more cerebral thinking. And I think you'd be amazed at the quality of feedback you can get out of that process. I mean, a case study for that approach is the success of MROC communities, which often challenge people to do a lot more thoughtful tasks, a lot more involved and engaging than traditional online research, and they really have flourished over the last few years. There's also an issue about how the types of thinking we can encourage with the way we ask questions. There is an over-dominance in a lot of surveys for asking people what might describe as system 2 analytical judgments. Which of these pet food products would you buy? What does that deliver back? It often delivers back analytical bits of assessment. So that the research that comes out of that might suggest that the product with the best ingredients is the one that people buy, whereas sales might argue that it's actually the one that's got the nicest packaging. And often you can't pick that up with traditional questioning techniques. There's also an issue of the way that we often ask questions in a personal perspective all the time. And I would encourage people to open that out to think a bit more projectively. I mean, this is a famous experiment. I apologize, I don't know remember the source of it, where a group of students were asked whether they would clean up after a meeting, and 50% of them said they would. And another group were actually asked to predict how many people would clean up after the meeting, and they predicted that they reckoned about 10% would. The reality was that the predictions were a lot closer to reality than the personal perspective. And often we can't be objective looking at things from a personal perspective. And so I would encourage two things. One, try and work out ways to mind what we call system 1 thinking. And if you want to find out about that technique and that approach, I'd thoroughly recommend you read Tom Ewing's brain juicer paper that won the SMR Congress Best Paper this year. It's about presenting them with choices and placing them under time pressure to make decisions. And it's about working out how to mine more emotional responses to things by putting things in more abstract terms. And the other area is moving away from what I suppose me thinking to we thinking. So instead of saying what would you do, get people to ask people what you think the average person might do. What do you think? Get people to bet on what other people will think. What would you buy this? Would your partner buy this? So getting people to look at these things in more than one dimension, and it's not a choice. I'm not suggesting that you ask it all your questions. You flip over to asking them always in this way. I'm suggesting you ask in both ways, and you mine the two different sets of thinking and look at the differences in the answers. Sorry, double-clicked. The next area is understanding the importance that imagery can have in surveys and the role that they can be used for. I do see such a poor grasp of use of imagery in surveys. There's so many sort of badly implemented bits of clip art and Google imagery used in surveys, and that's not good enough. Images have a really critical role to play in surveys, and using it in the right sort of way can really help people mine people's imaginations, trigger their memories and so on. Here's a couple of examples of some experiments we've done where we've used images to help trigger people's imaginations. The second example there, we ask people what foods they hate to eat, and when you show people a picture of someone expressing that emotion, you get people to give more answers. If you're asking people to evaluate a product or service, like in this example, they're evaluating Elvis Presley, by showing some pictures of him, people give us more clicks. And we found wherever we use imagery, it can trigger more of an emotive response in people, and you can get more feedback. It's also brilliant at encouraging people to mine their memories. So, for example, if I ask you to record some advertising, if I show you some prompts of the different advertising media, you'll get more feedback. The second example is, again, from one of our game experiments where we asked people to remember where they drank tap water yesterday, and just by showing a picture of a tap, it triggers more drinking instances being recorded. And just the use of imagery, for example, in brand usage and recall and brand awareness type questions can transform the feedback you get. We also find that images are a lot more easily processed by respondents than words. And take, for example, if you were asking people to answer a range question in these two different formats, we find that people are able to sort of emotionally process the pictures a lot more efficiently. It's more enjoyable, more fun, and they actually concentrate and give you better data. Here's some results from an experiment where we tested out that in different countries, and we found consistently we're getting better data from using images of faces rather than words, and it was giving us more cross-consistent data. We were able to reduce the variance of answers from one country to another, which is obviously a big problem in itself, by employing a more visual approach. The other area I would encourage people to get involved in doing online research is really understanding their weapons and how they work. As Bernie Malinoff has pointed out on several occasions, there's lots and lots of different ways you can ask questions creatively, but you really only have to blow on a Likert scale or a range question for the data to change. And I mean, just look at, for example, here's some research done by Thomas Randall from Harris Interactive, looking at the balance of answers you get based upon the range labels you offer. And if you compare bipolar fully anchored scale versus a unipolar scale, you get a completely different set of answers. And if you remove the center choices, you get again a different set of answers. And if you shift to, say, a 7-point anchored scale, you get what we would call a double hump. And if you then shift to a 7-point anchor scale with nothing in the middle, you get a really big central hump. If you then stretch that out to a 9-point scale, you get an even bigger central hump. And all I'm doing is asking exactly the same question, just changing the label choices on the end, and it's completely transforming the data. And that's before we even start thinking about flipping from one question format to another. So it's a big area of where saying, well, if you're going to start using online research, you really should know and understand as much as you can about the science of asking questions. Another big issue is asking questions that give the answers you really want to know. I see a lot of surveys that sort of skirt around issues, like, for example, you're trying to assess a brand and why people buy a brand, and you say, is it a modern brand, it's a brand I trust, and it's a brand I feel close to, and often these questions have very little bearing on why people buy a brand. And sometimes just asking the simple question, why do you buy it, is going to give you a lot more interesting and more to the point bits of feedback. So summing this up, there's a lot of creative processes involved in designing surveys. I would want to emphasize that a lot of this thinking is often applied right at the end of the process. You create a survey and then you kind of try to make it beautiful. And you end up with what might be the ugly sister issue, where you say, right, I'm going to start thinking about the creative points once I've designed the survey about how to, how can I ask this in a creative way, a fun, visual way. And you end up with what might be as decorating an ugly sister. And I would encourage you to start thinking about the creative issues and the design of surveys right at the early conception stage and not at the end stage, not when you're passing it over to the survey program to make it. And, do all these techniques work? I could say yes, but in actual fact, it's very much close to it can, because they're all involve a creative process, and it's a bit like advertising. Advertising can work and it can deliver you fantastic results, but it's in the hands of the creative, because you create a bad ad, it's not necessarily going to deliver results. And so that is one thing that I think that you need to consider, that this is a creative art form and it is in the hands of the designer. And that's it. I'll leave you with one thought that most respondents, I'm afraid, do surveys for money, and really as soon as they click on the link, they just want to get to the end of it as quickly as possible. What's going to stop them just racing through it? Well, it's in your hands in the way you design the survey, and that's the one thing I want to leave you with is this sense that you've got to move from thinking about just what you want to know from the survey to thinking about how to get people to think and stop and think. And hopefully some of this advice will aid you in that process. Thank you.